Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're pulling back the curtain on a piece of history that feels almost deliberately hidden. It's a story that really challenges a lot of simple ideas about power, about Islam, about, well, who gets to rule. We're heading to 17th century Southeast Asia, specifically the Aceh Sultanate. That's in modern-day Indonesia. Now, Aceh was a major power right on the Straits of Malacca, controlling vital trade. But here's the thing that grabs you. For almost 60 years, from 1641 to 1699, this really influential, deeply Muslim kingdom wasn't ruled by a sultan, but by four successive sultanas, women.
And the timing here is just critical. This wasn't some marginal kingdom in a quiet corner of the world. This was peak colonial expansion time. The Dutch, the VOC, and the Portuguese were aggressively moving into the region. These queens weren't just symbolic figures either. Not at all. They were right in the thick of it, dealing with trade, diplomacy, military threats. They actually kept Ace independent when many neighbors were falling under colonial control.
Yeah, that's the part I keep coming back to. It seems so counterintuitive for the 1600s. When you look at Europe then, or the Ottomans, the Mughals, a woman ruling a major power was rare, often controversial, right?
Extremely rare. Usually an exception that proved the rule.
So the big question for this deep dive isn't just that they ruled, it's how. How did this specific Islamic kingdom decide, not once, but four times in a row, that putting a woman on the throne was the best move? The most, well, pragmatic way to survive. That's the aha moment we're hunting for today.
Okay.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It all kicks off in 1641, a classic political problem, really. The Sultan, Iskandar Thani, dies suddenly. And crucially, no son to inherit.
Right, and this immediately created a massive risk for Ace. You can see it in the sources. The elites were genuinely worried about two things, mainly.
Okay.
One, that the different factions at court, the powerful families, would just descend into civil war, fighting over who should rule next, especially if the male options were seen as weak.
An internal collapse.
Exactly. Or two, maybe even worse, that the VOC, the Dutch, who were always sort of circling, would use the instability as the perfect excuse to just move in. Militarily.
Okay, so chaos or foreign domination, not great option.
Not at all. So they went for a third way. Stability. They crowned the late Sultan's widow, a woman named Taj al-Alam Safiatuddin Sia.
And the sources say this shocked outsiders, but felt natural inside Iya. Why natural?
Well, it seems like pure political calculation. She was connected to the previous ruling line, so that meant continuity, which was important. But also, as a woman, the thinking was probably that she wouldn't build up a huge personal army or power base that could totally dominate the other local chiefs, the Orang Kaya.
So it was a balancing act. She could unify without threatening the existing power structures too much.
Precisely. It kept the state together at a really vulnerable moment.
And she wasn't just a temporary fix. She ruled for, what was it, 34 years?
34 years. A massive reign, longer than most kings of that era anywhere. And she didn't just keep the peace internally, she actively maintained Ace's dominance in the Straits, often outplaying the European powers.
How did she manage that? What was her approach?
Well, a key part was her administrative skill, her flexibility. She had to navigate this really complex local system. It had two main pillars, you could say.
Go on.
There was Sharia Islamic law that provided the sort of overarching moral and legal framework. But then there was a dot.
A dot, that's local custom, right?
Exactly. Deeply ingrained local customs, traditions, common law. And a dot really governed a lot of the day-to-day politics, social structures, how power actually worked on the ground.
So like the Constitution versus the unwritten rules.
That's a pretty good way to think about it, yeah. Sharia was maybe the formal constitution, but Adat was how things actually got done, the operational code. And Safiatuddin was brilliant at making them work together. Where the strict letter of Islamic law might have conflicted with what Adat and political reality demanded for survival, well, Adat and pragmatism often carried the day. And this earned her respect from both the religious scholars, the ulama, and the powerful merchant class.
Okay, so she found a way to be both pious and practical. And that long, successful rule, it basically proved the concept, didn't it? It showed that a woman could rule effectively in Ace.
Absolutely. That's the crucial precedent she set. She made female rule a legitimate, viable option within their specific political culture. It wasn't just theoretical anymore.
Which, of course, paved the way for the next three queens.
Couldn't have happened without her success, I think. She took away the fear of the unknown.
Okay, so she stabilizes things internally. But Ace isn't in a vacuum. Let's talk about the outside world, because geographically, Ace was sitting on something everyone wanted, right?
Oh, completely. Location, location, location. Ace controlled access to the Malacca Strait, the main highway between India and China. Plus, it was a major source of pepper and tin.
Basically, the oil and microchips of the 17th century.
Pretty much. So the Dutch, the Portuguese, the English, they were all desperate for access, for favorable trade deals, ideally monopolies. They were constantly probing, pressuring Ace.
And suddenly these big European powers, funded by massive trading companies, run by men who, let's be honest, probably held pretty condescending views. They have to negotiate serious deals with a queen, a sultana.
Yeah, you can just imagine the friction. We actually have letters from Dutch envoys back home, and they show this mix of fascination and, frankly, unease.
How so?
Well, you read accounts of these very formal Dutch officials having to follow Asene's court protocol, getting off their horses far from the palace, sometimes having to, perform acts of deference, maybe even kiss the hand or the knee of the sultana.
A woman they might privately look down on.
Exactly. But they couldn't afford to be openly disrespectful, because behind the sultana was real power. Ace had a strong navy for the time, impressive fortresses that couldn't just be pushed around.
So the queens used that leverage.
Masterfully. Their diplomacy was all about defiance, really. They insisted on dealing directly with high-level European envoys, no intermediaries, and crucially, they refused to give any single European power a monopoly on trade.
The balancing act again. Play them off against each other.
That was the key. They were constantly shifting alliances, granting limited access here, denying it there, Portuguese against the Dutch, Dutch against the English. Keep everyone competing, nobody gets full control.
And that's how they stayed independent, while others didn't.
It's a huge part of it. Many neighboring states got locked into exclusive, often ruinous treaties with the VOC. Ace managed to avoid that trap for decades by keeping its options open. That refusal to be cornered, that's a massive part of their 17th century legacy.
Okay, so Safiyettin sets the precedent. But for this to become a real era of queens, the system had to work after her, right? It couldn't just be about one exceptional person.
Exactly. The transitions were vital proof. After Safiyettin died in 1675, they crowned Sultana Nakhichevan.
Her reign was shorter.
Only 3 years, yes. But those 3 years were important. Just the fact that the transition happened smoothly, that another woman took the throne, it reinforced the idea. It continued that delicate balancing act internally and externally.
And then came a third queen.
Yes, Sultana Zakwatuddin. She ruled for a solid decade, 1678 to 1688. This was a period where Dutch power elsewhere in the region was really growing, consolidating. But Ace, under Zakwatuddin, remained stable and independent.
What was her focus?
She seems to have been very politically savvy. She made sure to support Islamic institutions, patronize the ulama, the religious scholars, keep them close.
Why was that so important?
Well, it basically neutralized potential religious opposition to her rule. By being a strong patron of the faith, she shored up her own legitimacy. These middle reigns, Nakwatuddins and Zakwatuddins, they weren't maybe as dramatic as the first, but their stability was powerful proof that queenship wasn't a fluke. It was now a working part of the Asenese state.
Which brings us back to that core puzzle you mentioned earlier. How did they maintain that religious legitimacy? How did this Muslim kingdom square female rule with, well, the more common interpretations elsewhere?
Right. This is where we need to dig into that Assamese synthesis again. The key, as we touched on, seems to be the power of adat local custom in the political sphere working alongside Sharia. In Assa's political culture, the absolute highest priority, it seems, was preserving the unity and independence of the state. Everything else was secondary to that.
So when Sultan Iskandar Thani died childless, and later when the other queens were chosen, why weren't the male candidates seen as viable? Weren't there any?
Oh, there likely were male relatives, yes. But the problem was, any strong male contender probably represented a specific faction, a powerful family or region. Putting one of them on the throne risked tearing the kingdom apart through internal rivalries.
Which would open the door for
the Dutch, exactly. So choosing a woman, especially one connected to the previous rulers by marriage but maybe without her own immediate independent military base, was seen as the safer bet, a more neutral figure, the pragmatic choice to keep everyone together.
So pragmatism, state survival, literally trumped the more conservative interpretation of who should rule. But they couldn't just do that quietly, could they? They had to show she ruled with full authority, including religious authority.
Absolutely critical. And they did. We have clear evidence. This wasn't some hidden power behind the throne. These sultanas ruled openly with all the symbols of sovereignty.
Like what?
Well, for instance, they issued coins with their own names and titles stamped on them. That's a major public declaration of legitimate rule in any pre-modern state.
Okay, that's significant. What else?
Even more importantly, perhaps, their names were included in the khutbah.
The Friday sermon in the mosque.
Exactly. Having the ruler's name proclaimed during the main weekly prayer across the entire sultanate. That's a massive affirmation of their accepted religious and political standing.
So week after week, the message was, she is the legitimate ruler under God.
Precisely. And beyond that, they were active patrons of Islamic scholarship. Safiatuddin, in particular, funded scholars, libraries, religious schools. Aceh became a major center for Islamic learning, attracting intellectuals from Arabia and India.
So far from being seen as undermining Islam, they positioned themselves as defenders and patrons of the faith.
They did. It wasn't about challenging the faith. It was about an interpretation rooted in local conditions and the overriding need for survival that allowed for female leadership to preserve an Islamic state. It was incredibly sophisticated political communication.
An amazing balancing act for decades. But, like all eras, it eventually came to an end. The last queen, Colonial, she ruled until 1699. What changed? Why did it stop then?
Yeah, the tide definitely turned during her reign. The pressures just became overwhelming, both from outside and inside.
Externally, the Dutch getting stronger.
Much stronger and much less willing to be played off against rivals. The VOC was becoming the dominant power across the Indonesian archipelago. Their patience for Ace's independence was wearing thin.
And internally.
Hmm.
Those factions that had accepted queens for stability.
They started getting restless again. Perhaps they sensed weakness or maybe just opportunity. The internal unity that had made female rule possible started to fray.
And then there was this specific event in 1699, something about a fatwa.
Yes, a fatwa, a religious decree, was issued by conservative scholars, mainly based in the Hejaz in Arabia, and this fatwa specifically argued against the legitimacy of female rulers in Islam.
Ah, so that was it. An external religious ruling ended the era.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. It's crucial to understand the fatwa didn't come out of nowhere and it wasn't universally accepted instantly. More likely, it served as a trigger or maybe an excuse.
An excuse for whom?
For those factions within Aceh who already wanted to replace Kamalatsia with a male ruler. Suddenly, they had this external, authoritative religious opinion they could point to.
So it wasn't the fatwa itself that forced the change, but it gave the internal opposition the religious cover they needed to act.
That seems to be the most likely interpretation. It became a powerful political tool. It allowed them to depose Kamalatsia and install a male sultan without looking like they were just making a power grab or defying local tradition outright. They could frame it as upholding a broader Islamic norm.
Wow. So after nearly 60 years of successful rule by women, it ends because of this convergence. Increased colonial pressure, internal divisions, and an external religious ruling that gave one side the leverage it needed.
Exactly. A perfect storm, really. It's a stark reminder of how even long-standing, successful political arrangements can be dismantled when the internal and external conditions shift dramatically.
So, looking back at this whole remarkable period, nearly 6 decades of female rule on a major Islamic power, what should we take away from it today? Why does this sort of forgotten history matter?
Oh, it matters hugely, primarily because it just shatters any simplistic, monolithic view of Islamic history or political practice. Aceh shows incredible diversity, adaptation, flexibility. It demonstrates that political choices in Muslim societies, like anywhere else, were often driven by local needs, by custom, by pure pragmatism, not just by some single, rigid interpretation of doctrine.
And the queens themselves, their legacy.
It's a legacy of incredible resilience, isn't it? I mean, think about it. They faced down the most powerful corporations and empires of their day. They navigated complex internal politics. It's a powerful reminder that leadership, real effective leadership, isn't about gender. It's about ability, vision, and sheer political skill. Something those rather arrogant Dutch envoys had to learn when bowing before a queen who held all the cards.
4 women ruling consecutively, keeping a major state sovereign against huge odds for almost 60 years. It's just astonishing when you frame it like that.
It really is. And their memory isn't totally lost, It lives on in local Acehnese chronicles, in oral traditions, in Banda Asia. It makes you think, doesn't it? Consider this. What political structures or arrangements exist today, maybe guided by local custom or sheer necessity, things we might see as temporary or unusual? What things are happening now that historians 300 years in the future might look back on as being radically pragmatic or surprisingly progressive?
Hmm. What seems like an exception now might be setting a precedent we don't even recognize yet.
Exactly. That's the kind of deep, challenging thought the sultanas of Ace provoke.
A perfect place to leave it. Thank you for guiding us through that incredible story. And thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.